Canadian writer, producer, and director Loretta Todd has been working in the film industry for over 3 decades. But 2020 marks a special milestone for her debut as a feature film director. Monkey Beach, which is opening the 2020 edition of the Vancouver International Film Festival, is an adaptation of Eden Robinson's acclaimed novel of the same title. I recently had a chance to speak with Loretta about the struggle to get this film made, her adaptation process, and why she pushed so hard to ensure that the film was shot on location in Kitimat. First of all, congratulations on the film. It's really wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
And I wanted to start kind of leading up to Monkey Beach. You've had a long career as a documentary filmmaker. What was the prompt to turn you into a feature?
So it kind of goes back to when the story I've been sharing. So, I mean, sometimes I feel like, oh, here I am sharing the same story, but I'm going to share it with you anyways because it's the truth, it's the history. Basically, what happened was I was being, actually, I was asked to direct a feature back in the day and based on a book that this producer was trying to option, but they weren't able to option it. I think just whatever happened. But I was able to watch the process, and I thought, gee, I could probably do that, and there's a lot of amazing Indigenous books out there I would love to turn into film. And about that time, I was at a film event in Vancouver, and a filmmaker came up to me, Jillian Darling, and she said, Loretta, you should option Monkey Beach. And I said, why? And she said, because your filmmaking is like Eden's writing. So, oh, that's interesting. I had always wanted to read the book, but I just hadn't had a chance. So I promptly went out and bought the book. And before I even read it, I looked in the back and she had acknowledgments. And I was named in the acknowledgments because I guess as she had seen one of my films, which she used as help with her research for her book, but also because she, I guess, I don't know, is an inspirational person. So then I read the book. And then, of course, when I read the book, it just made sense that this book had to be on screen because it is so cinematic and it is so profound, and because it layers so many ways of of experiencing and telling a story, and because the characters are so strong, and because I really I think like so many readers identified with Lisa Marie in the book, but Lisa in the film. So it just seemed like it was meant to be. And so then I reached out to Eden to see if she would be interested in me optioning it. And she said yes. So then I followed up with her agents, and, the rest is sort of history.
And when did that process start for you?
Oh, I don't always like to say because it's been over 10 years.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's really interesting because that's actually one of the things that I wanted to ask you about. In the current climate, we're jumping ahead a bit, but in the current climate, we're hearing a lot of stories about, inclusion and diversity and how these are now like key hot topic words that people are bantering about. But it's something that, I mean, you have been championing for decades. I mean, all of your films have been, like a learning and about educating and about inclusion and knowing that these stories are out there and they need to be shared. And I'm curious because I spoke with Jeff Barnaby a couple of weeks back, and he was very critical of the way the industry is moving and how we were bantering around these words, but on the ground nothing is really being done, and the movies just aren't being produced at the same rate as other cultures. How do you feel, I mean, having been working on this for 10 years, how do you feel that we're doing as as Canadian funders? How do you think that we're doing, allowing filmmakers as yourself to tell these important stories?
Well, I have to go back even further because, I went to film school, and when I got, that's what I wanted to do, was feature films, and life took me into documentaries, which I was very honored, and I cherish and value those times working in documentary, and I will continue to work in documentary, and it's still a really important part of who I am as a filmmaker and storyteller. But I had, dreams and aspirations to make feature films, but I guess back then in the 90s, that wasn't really seen. In fact, I was told by somebody once, by a producer, a white male producer, that the reason there aren't that many women in the industry directing is because they don't have authority on set. They don't have the authority to be able to, carry a set, and that, a Native woman would have even less authority. So, we're battling these sort of deeply held systemic attitudes, not just to our films and story, but to who we are. So, these sort of perceptions of us as broken and lacking in authority and unable to kind of manage these important things that only in the past white males were able to manage. So there certainly is a history. I was asked by three, in addition to the scripts that I've written over the years, there was also other people who approached me about directing their scripts, and we took them all to telefilm. And I think I have to kind of separate the personal from the organization. So the personal, in the Vancouver telefilm office, there was always a door that was open. There was always some support. Maybe it wasn't a lot of support, but it was some support, and it kept the productions kind of moving forward. But there never was that systemic support to take everything to the next level, to sort of say, okay, yeah, we're going to get behind these productions, we're going to get behind these filmmakers. It wasn't there. But what we were doing in the meantime, as activists or whatever you want to call us, we were trying to change that at that systemic level. So we started Aboriginal. We used the word Aboriginal then. We kind of alternated Indigenous, Aboriginal. So we built these different organizations to lobby, to kind of put forward what we felt would be needed for that systemic change. In the 90s, we saw things like, National Film Board had an Indigenous studio that was sort of initiated by Will Campbell and Maria Campbell, that it survived for a little while, but then it got discontinued. And, imagine if it had kept going. So there's definitely these sort of like ingrained colonial mentalities that are very dominant still. Although individually, there are people who are working within those systems who do want change and who are making change. So, but the bigger systemic battles are the ones that are kind of more elusive. Like, how do you make that big transition, and how do you insist on that transition? How do you kind of have the political weight? I remember talking to some, Indigenous politicians, and if you look at the UNDRIP, if you look at the Truth and Reconciliation, if you look at even going back to the Royal Commission, all of those talk about Indigenous people controlling our image, our story, having the means and access to technology to be able to further practice our culture. It's got different names and different terms, but they're there. So if we're talking about this sort of systemic change, people often just think of it as sort of like, oh, we just, sort of a very narrow kind of way of looking at it, but it actually has to encompass all aspects of our life. And one of the ways you sustain your culture is through storytelling and through practicing your culture. And how do you storytell and practice your culture in today's world? Well, you do it with all these myriad of technologies and all these myriad of platforms that can carry those stories and those expressions of culture. So there's huge shifts that have to take place. One of the biggest things that we've never been able to do as independent producers, because I'm a filmmaker and an independent producer, is that we never had those decades of those little kind of industrial initiatives that enabled those companies to build great capital. So we get these, when I do a production, because I also produce children's series like Coyote Science. So when I do that, I have to pretty well put 90% of my tax credits into my budgets. And I think, most independent productions do that now, but there have been times where some of those bigger productions, they don't do that. They get these kind of tax credits that kind of benefit, and they could put it in their pocket, or they can use it to kind of reactivate their companies or sustain their companies or develop and grow and so on. We haven't had that. We haven't had that infusion of capital. And I think that's one of the really, really critical things. And because really, we need to own our productions. Like Coyote Science, I own 100%. But with most feature films, because of tax credits and so on, you usually, people bring in, a 49%, co-producer to be able to access those tax credits. So these are all kind of systemic things that really need to be re-examined and reinvented, because otherwise we're always going to kind of be I don't want to say playing catch up, but we're always going to be sort of on the margins. We're never going to have quite enough, or a few are going to have a lot and the rest aren't. I always use this model of the Canadian industrial model. It doesn't just apply to the film industry or television. It applies in fishing and logging and, all the kind of resource-based economies. Over the years, there was a lot of independent fishermen. And then when the government said, okay, we're going to put just sort of an industrial model where there'd be a few big mega owners of fishing license, and all these little boats sold to these big mega fishing conglomerates who then, basically destroyed the fisheries. I mean, there's more to it than that. But that's always been kind of the Canadian industrial model that's been applied to film and television, where, few big players, because it's easier to deal with a few big players than, a whole bunch of little independents. But in the Indigenous way, that's not, everybody is sort of equal, if you like, and everybody is kind of a partner in the expression of culture and storytelling. And so, our economic model, I think, has to pervade if we're to be able to have and to sustain our own economy, beyond this sort of blip that's going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
Like you say, it took me 10 years or over 10 years to make this. And, I was kind of ahead of my time. And I would break my heart if, another 10 filmmakers had to wait another 10, 15 years to be able to tell their story. So, or that I have to wait another 10 years to be able to make my next feature.
Mm-hmm.
So there's serious sort of deep change. But, there's some good things. Like recently I saw that CMF passed a policy that said that Indigenous productions, that the creative person who's driving that production, has control over the budget, over the creative, over the marketing, all those things. And that's really critical to this next phase as well, if we're to really sort of, lead our own industry. But, I'm not, this also includes, this also includes the broadcasters. This also includes National Film Board and Canada Council. All these sort of institutions that are basically, designed to create Canadian culture. Since this is the essence. We are the essence of Canada. These stories, the only place these stories exist are here. Our stories come out of the very lifeblood of this land, and will continue on for, hopefully for, centuries and more into the future. That I really do think Indigenous storytelling, has to be at the center. But also, again, in our philosophy, I mean, I'm not responsible for all the other communities in Canada for telling their stories, but in our philosophy, they would also have that freedom and space to be able to tell their stories and be honored for their, in the telling of their stories as well.
With all the struggles that you've had in getting the film made, one of the things that's really impressed me is, one, that it's here for us to partake in. And I was curious about, considering everything that you've just said, and then these other external pressures, like the fact that, this novel is really celebrated and really well respected, on top of all of the other pressures of actually getting the project made. Were there even more sort of intrinsic pressures about, doing right by this really well respected and really well loved novel and story?
Um, well, from pressure on myself, by myself. I mean, certainly I wanted to do the best I could for Eden and her, because of course, I mean, she's stuck by me all these years, never gave up on me. So, I mean, I wanted to make sure that I did something that, she was going to really, feel did her storytelling, respected her storytelling and honored her storytelling and, honored her, the integrity of how she tells a story and why she tells a story and so on. So those were really critical as far as if there was pressure, the pressure was often do you need to be this um, the pressure was always trying to fit her storytelling and my storytelling into a more conventional way of telling a story. So the pressure was always, well, but can you make it more three-act plot driven? So that was always the struggle, and I think it's the struggle in general. Maybe it's less struggle now, but for me, over these years, that's been the struggle. How it would be easier if you would perhaps made it more conventional, um, or it would be easier if you didn't insist on filming in Kitimat because you could film in Vancouver and up Hell Sound, you could find another Indigenous village to stand in for Kitimat. So there was always that kind of pressure, and some of it was more just people maybe trying to be helpful, like, oh, gee, Loretta, this is like you're putting such a big task on yourself. You're putting a big responsibility on yourself to try to make this film in Kitimat when you don't have to, because most films aren't made in where they're necessarily set because of practicalities and budgets and logic. But for me, I just continue to insist that I needed to find a way to make it actually in Kitimat. Um, but but yeah, I mean, I think most of the pressure to really do something that would be very respectful to the storytelling and to the book, and that was really pressure I put on myself.
You touch on two things there that I think are really interesting. And the first is this idea that you have to try to make this story more palpable to the general masses with this, traditional three-act structure. But one of the things that I find really fascinating is that it's a really beautiful and really just wonderfully nuanced sort of introduction to Indigenous tradition and the marriage between your people, the people and the land and the spiritual, which is something that I find often gets confused or lost in translations of these types of stories. So I'm really curious about how you managed to do that translation from the book to a standard sort of film, but still maintain like that theme and that really intrinsic connection, because that's so clear from the opening scenes of the film, like that marriage of and the importance of the people and the land.
Well, I mean, I'm not from there.
Hmm.
First of all, I mean, I'm from the pre-Métis land, sort of the edge of the boreal forest, northeastern Alberta. My family is originally from a mixture of the Métis from Winnipeg, the original families at the Métis settlement in Winnipeg, also from Turtle Mountain in the Dakotas, the Chippewa there, and then also finally St. Paul de Métis, which is gone now, but my grandfather from there married my grandmother who was from the Whitefish Lake First Nation. So I'm kind of my landscape, if you like, is flat with a little
Hmm.
bit of rolling hill. But I think that um, for me, even as a child and then even as a filmmaker, the films that really stayed with me, the ones that really kind of haunted me, were the ones where the land became part of the story. And I remember there's a filmmaker here in Vancouver. We used to call her, she's a filmmaker's filmmaker, a woman named Eliette. and her stories, she used to make these short experimental films in which there was just this haunting light from the prairies. When you're a kid, you just sit there in a hot summer day and you just watch the clouds as they kind of, you know, get blown across the sky and the shadows they cast, and the light as it kind of, and then how that changes the light on the ground, and through the windows and so on. And so to me, I've always been really moved by films that make land a part of the story. And when I've taught, I've even asked the students. I've also asked the students. I said, what's your relationship to light? Like, what do you recall growing up when you were a child? Your first memory of light. It doesn't even have to be a totally beautiful natural light. Maybe you grew up in a totally urban environment, and your first light was a harsh you know, um, you know, um, harsh kind of, artificial light, or maybe it was the light of neon at night, when you were out, trying to, who knows, on some kind of strange, urban adventure. I've always asked them to talk about what's their relationship to light, and then ask them to what's their relationship to shadow, because as we know, film is all light and shadow. So what's their relationship to shadow? Is shadow was something that comforted them? Was shadow something that frightened them because there might be monsters in there? So I always ask them to kind of go on that journey, as storytellers and visual storytellers, to sort of like really inhabit and get to know their relationship to light and to shadow. And then I ask them to talk about, well, what but then what does that, if and then if where, and a lot of the students, they have grown up on their territory. So, what is your relationship to your territory? How have you come to know your territory? How is it visceral? How is it tangible? How does it smell and feel, and all those things that sort of help them build that relationship. So, um, and then I asked them to, think about how they could create with that. And with So with Monkey Beach, it was important for me. And then I've lived out here for a very long time. I ran away from home, so I've been out here since like I was 13, and on the coast. So I've had a long relationship. I've had a longer relationship with the land here than I've had with the land where I'm from. But it's not my territory. I mean, I'm very conscious of the fact that it's still not my territory. But I still, have for a long time had this sort of relationship with the way the light changes all the time here on the coast, because the clouds are always coming and going. How wind brings different a different feel to the land. How the land looks when it's been clear cut, how the land looks and the light and shadow looks when it's been, in a rainforest, in a thick, dense rainforest. How water can be fierce, and yet it can be gentle. So all these things, I have built up my own sort of personal relationship with these things. And then I was fortunate to go up to Kitimat, a few times, not as much as I would have liked, to sort of be there and go to the real Monkey Beach, with Eden and her dad and her cousin, and just stare for as long as I could at at the sky and the water and the village, and just feel as close as it as I could, and yet know that I never will be because it's not my territory. So those were all things that were all sort of part of this process. And so, um, home is always a big theme in my filmmaking. So this idea of home really starts the film, because she talks about going home. And that journey in my original director's notes, it was a much more it was a much more visual journey. It would have been a bit more experimental in terms of that journey home, but I've captured a little bit of that still, in terms of what my original vision was. But yes, going home is so important, and I think for Native people, whether we are in someone else's territory or whether we are in our own, home is something that just inhabits our heart, and we love it with all our heart. And so I think that I could bring that to this film, that love of home. And I
Hmm.
think that's one of the things that I've really tried to do. Because sometimes people think about that. They say, okay, there's this abstraction land, and certainly, but really it's home. And
Hmm.
I think that's the thing I try to work a lot with.
You mentioned before, and you've mentioned again how Kitimat plays such an important role, and I thought it was really wonderful because, like you mentioned, there aren't a lot of films that are shot in Kitimat, but the fact that you're there and the beautiful, like the gorgeous shots, the overheads, and just like it just feels like so. I don't know. It's so almost surreal. Like this cannot really be a real place. It's just so beautiful. It's almost ethereal. And I was wondering how you and your cinematographer worked to kind of like build this kind of real but also kind of mystical Kitimat.
Well, I think for one thing, we didn't really, in a way, need to do it because I mean, I think that word mystical can be kind of misunderstood. Um, but in a way, when you're there, it's just a very powerful place. I mean, it's a very powerful place, and you can't help but feel it. You can't help but be moved by it and be inhabited and kind of be drawn into it. But yeah, from the very beginning, I talked with Sterling Bancroft, who I loved working with, and I talked to him about how I wanted to have a particular look. And there was a film that came out, Moonlight.
Hmm.
And Moonlight, if you notice, it was filmed with a particular type of lens. Not, I don't think the whole film, but a lot of the film, where the background isn't just blurry, because that's kind of the common thing now. A lot of things are these sort of, it's no longer deep focus, but the sort of like the background is sort of out of focus. But in Moonlight, it was more than that, where the background actually feels electric. It feels alive. There's a quality to those lenses that kind of create a almost swirl to what's behind, and that felt like electricity to me. That made it feel like the whole frame was alive. It wasn't just what's in the foreground. It felt like everything was kind of contained within that aliveness of those lenses. So that those lenses help kind of create. So that was really important, and he was really excited about wanting to work with those lenses as well. We weren't able to use them as much as we would have liked, just because of logistics and so on. But I tried to use them as much as I could. And then there's just the light. A lot of it also came down to the color correcting in the post with the amazing color corrector who's at Encore, who I want to say is Orlando. I hope I'm forgetting his name. I feel sorry, but it would be in the credits. But anyways, the great color corrector. Between Sterling and myself, kind of wanting to have um, a sort of a very uh, again, almost visceralness, or like trying to make the 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 space feel alive, so that you feel like you're totally immersed in that place. And so that's also some of the color correcting. Some of it is the texture, the amount of grain that I added into the scene
Hmm.
later in post. But yeah, it was certainly in my early director's notes, when I was first trying to get the film made, and I had done a book, basically a book, like a 20-page book that, basically took whoever, I was hoping to finance the film on this journey of what the film would be. I made it very clear. One of the, clear things in that book was this idea of the land as alive and land as character. And so, again, having been in this territory for as long as I've been, I feel I can, I think I have a good sort of sense of what those forests look like, what what they look like best at this light or that light, or and so on, and so that also came into play.
But I wanted to kind of finish up by asking you about, we talked a little bit about how it took 10 years to get this made. Really, really hoping it does not take 10 years to get the next one made. What else are you working on? Are you planning on continuing with features? Are you going to go back to documentaries? Do you have
Um,
something else lined up?
well, there's a documentary I've been trying to make, and I'm hoping will happen. It's something with the film board, um, but it's based on storytelling. It's about storytelling, basically about how story can heal, and it's sort of directed at my family, and whether healing can, story can help heal. So that's kind of one of the projects that I've been working on for a while as well. I also have scripts that I've written in the past. I took a script to Sundance Writers Lab that still is. It's kind of an experimental feature. Well, I wouldn't say experimental feature. It's a feature that's was based on my kind of reimagining events that happened in my life when I was a child, and it's sort of a bit of a fantasy, I guess. I also have a Paris script that one day I want to make. It's a period piece, and involves Native characters and different times in Paris. It's after the Second World War and at the turn of the century as well. It's a ghost story. So I hope that someday I'll be able to bring that to screen. Although when I used to shop it around back in the day, people said, "Oh well, Loretta, this is like a millions of dollar budgets. And, you're never going to be able to make it." But I haven't given up yet, and I have also thought about turning it into a novel, and then seeing if that can help kind of jumpstart it. I have other scripts, and people approach me about optioning their books, or I approach people about optioning their books. So there's a lot in the works. There's something also from where I'm originally from, or where my family is originally from. Sort of tragic story that happened there that I would like to tell. Um, so there's there's a lot of stories for sure. I mean, there's no end of stories, and so I'm hoping, same as you, I'm hoping it won't take so long this time. I'm a kind of a perpetual outsider, um, so sometimes that works for me, sometimes it works against me. I mean, I'm obviously part of my family and part of my community, but in terms of the industry, I don't think they know quite what to do with me. But I persevere. I never give up, and this is testament even more that I never give up. So hopefully that's a message to all of them that no, she's not going to give up. So and in terms of that sort of you know long term change, that it's Jared, Barnaby, like, sorry, not saying his first name, said, we've just got to keep fighting for it. I mean, we've been fighting for it for a long time, in terms of various sort of organizational sort of efforts, and the lobbying efforts, and so on. And so I'll continue to do that, with in the ways that I can make help make change.
And that was my conversation with the writer and director of Monkey Beach, Loretta Sarah Todd.